Thank you everybody for attending. It's really exciting. We've got more than 60 people registered for today's webinar across, I want to say at least 4 continents, but maybe 5. So it's a good breadth of an audience where we can really share some of the learnings we've had in the presentation we put together here today. So very excited to share that with you guys. For those of you who are attending for the first time, we do this webinar. It's part of a monthly webinar series. We call it Scratching the Surface Mount. And basically what we go over is, it's not necessarily specifically related to CalcuQuote, although it does revolve around quoting for EMS generally. It's basically designed to be able to share some of the knowledge that we've learned through our research, through our just our experiments, as well as through being able to work with more than 70 EMS companies across North America now. So with that, what I'd like to do is get started by giving a brief introduction. So let me see if I can move forward here. And also, I guess it would help me if you can let me know that you can see the slides. So let me know if you're able to see the screen here with the slides as well, please. Okay. Yeses from multiple people. Fantastic. Thank you. So those of you who have not met me before, my name is Chintan Sutaria, and I am the founder and president of CalcuQuote. A little bit about my background. I grew up in the EMS industry because my family had a contract manufacturing business growing up. So since I was 11, I was doing all kinds of jobs, whether it was soldering or as I got older, I got to do some of the other things as well. But really, I've gotten a lot of experience with the EMS industry. I do have a background in business and have worked for a few of the larger consulting firms. So I've worked with multinational corporations primarily on the supply chain related processes. And then most recently, I got back into the EMS space and started CalcuQuote a few years ago. And what CalcuQuote is, if you haven't heard of that, not sure how you would have gotten to this webinar, but CalcuQuote is an RFQ management system for contract manufacturers. Specifically, we work with electronics contract manufacturers to help them figure out their speed and accuracy of the RFQ process. And what that means is we include everything from capturing your customers' requirements, labor, materials, overhead, markup, some of the things we're going to be talking about in today's webinar as well. So if you have any questions about that, check out calcuquote.com, and we'd love to talk to you about it. With that, let me also explain a little bit about the reason why we chose this webinar topic in particular. And it does say something that we had a really good turnout for this webinar. Largely, we chose this because EMS quoting is hard. Basically, you're, as a contract manufacturer, being asked to give a price for something that you've never built before, and you have to do it in a hurry, and you have to assume the risk. It's a fixed bid type of quote. And so with cost modeling, overhead allocation, markup, we've studied the problem a lot because it does represent a really big risk, and we've seen a lot of how companies do it. So that's what we're here to share today. That's why we chose this topic today, because we found that it was of a lot of interest to a lot of our customers already. So let's go over the agenda. As you can probably tell from the title, we're going to talk about 3 things today. We're going to talk about cost modeling, we're going to talk about overhead allocation, and we're going to talk about what to consider when you're doing your markup. And basically, the first one that we go over is going to be cost modeling, because it'll set up the scope of what the categories in a cost model are. And then we'll dive deeper into 2 of those, which is going to be overhead and markup. So let's get started with that. We're going to start with cost modeling here. And the first thing I'd like to do here is define what a cost model is. So over here on the left-hand side, you get to see the full dictionary, boring definition of what a cost model is. But to simplify it a little bit, a cost model is something that is something that is an algorithm or a formula that converts resources into costs. And to better define what that means, a resource is something that your company has. So think of materials, labor, capital investment, risk, expertise, etc. And a cost is an amount that you have to pay or give up. And give up is a key part of that. So it doesn't only include money leaving your bank account, it can also include opportunity costs. So an example of that would be something that can turn a resource statement into a cost statement. So let's look at an example. I've got here, so for example, I've got a resource of 5 hours of labor, and a cost model would be something that says 5 hours of labor will cost $100, right? And there's a few other examples here. So using my machines is going to cost $40, keeping my lights on is $15, etc. What it's basically doing is it's converting my resources into costs. And that's kind of the most primitive definition that I can provide of a cost model. Now, what we're going to talk about more specifically today, because I understand the audience is primarily contract manufacturers, we're going to talk about cost modeling as it applies to contract manufacturers. And so for that, one of the most important things here is to think about how you categorize costs within a cost model. And I've got here over here on the left-hand side, you can see they're made to look like buckets kind of, but there's 4 different categories over here. There's materials, labor, overhead, and markup. And the reason I choose these 4 is because these are pretty representative of what most contract manufacturers deal with. Starting from the top left and moving to the bottom right, they also represent the costs that are most easy or I guess calculable, if that's a word, down to the softest, most variable ones, right? So we'll start by saying that no matter how you categorize it, whether you want to make it into more granular buckets than this, or if you want to keep it really high level, either way, there's 2 principles that you should definitely follow when categorizing your costs. The first one is that your categories should be mutually exclusive. And what I mean by that is that if you have material costs and you're adding a little markup on top of it, recognize that that is markup and not materials, right? So we see this a lot where, companies that we're doing an early engagement with will say, well, I like to fudge the numbers on my costed BOM a little bit to make sure that there's a little bit extra wiggle room in there for me. What ends up happening inevitably with that is that somebody will do the costed BOM and put their little markup in there. And then it's somebody else's job later on to come up with the final markup for the assembly. And so what you've done, and this is going to be a mouthful here, is you've marked up the markup on your materials, right? So you're double dipping or you're double compounding what that markup is. And so that represents a potential risk where you could become less competitive in your customer's eyes. The second thing I'll say is, in addition to being mutually exclusive, you want it to be completely exhaustive. And what I mean by that is that you want to make sure all of your costs are considered, right? So one of the things that we hear sometimes is that, oh, well, my customer is never going to pay for this. And I'll use one of the most ludicrous examples I can think of is, somebody saying that, well, my customer is not going to pay for the vacation pay that my employees have. And that's true. If you put vacation pay as a line item on your quote to your customer, no customer in their right mind will actually award you that business. There's no disputing that. But the fact is that your company does incur that expense, right? It is an actual cost that your company has. And so you want to factor that into something, whether you consider that as part of your overhead, whether you consider that as part of your labor, it doesn't matter. But somewhere that cost needs to be considered. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're operating at a loss. You're not considering that into the profit margins that you think you have. So those are the 2 main principles to think of in determining the cost categorization. What I'd like to do next is actually go into each one of these one by one to show you an example of what they mean. So we're going to start with materials because that one is the most, I'd say it's the hardest one, as in it's the most firm one to come up with. And largely it's firm because what you're doing is you're basically acting as a translator. You're saying, I've got a bill of material for my customer. I give it to my suppliers, they tell me how much something costs, and I record that and compile it, right? So what you're doing is taking an existing cost and compiling it into one that you can communicate back to your customer. Most people with this would say that the material costs over here represents the actual cost of the component. Sometimes you can fuzzy that up a little bit by making it a little bit more comprehensive by saying that it includes leader and attrition, or what we'd call scrap or manufacturing variance, whatever you want to call it. But the point is that you can include some of that. And then the third thing here that sometimes falls into this bucket, or rather often falls into this bucket, is consumables that are directly related to a job. And what I mean by this is not it's not solder and flux, right? That goes on every job, every assembly, etc. What this typically means is if you're considering your material costs, then it would be special packaging. It would be a particular label that the customer has asked you to put on the board. It could be a special type of adhesive that the customer has asked you to use, those types of things. Okay, so with the material cost, let's see how the cost adjusts as the quantity changes, right? So I've got over here on the right-hand side a little graph. First, let's look at the top thing over here. So what I'm showing you is the total cost. And with material cost, typically, as the quantity increases, the material cost also increases. The total material cost generally increases. And if I look at the unit cost, as the quantity increases, the unit cost more or less stays flat. Now you'll see over here that it does have a somewhat of a downward sloping trend over here. And this one also starts to slope a little bit more horizontally as it gets into the higher quantities. And the reason for that is because in contract manufacturing, one of the things that we deal with is that as the quantity changes, so does the price of your materials. So if you're buying one item, let's say you're buying one resistor, it might cost you 25 cents, but if you're buying 100,000 of them, then it's going to cost you a lot more. So that's why it's really important to consider that, as the total cost increases, as the quantity increases, the total cost does flatten out a little bit, but not completely. It is still proportional to the quantity. Okay, let's talk about labor. So on labor, it's a little bit more complex than the materials because you have different types of labor expenses, right? So I've got 3 examples here. There's job setup, there's batch setup, and there's assembly costs. So the first 2 are setup related expenses, whereas the last one over there is a variable expense. But let's look at this one as an example. So a job setup is something that you'd have that comes in for each job that you have to do. Right? So that's not necessarily something that you'd repeat for the number of assemblies you have or something like that. It's really, you do it once and then that's it. The batch setup is something that you'd have to do for each run of the job. So for example, let's say you have a 10,000 piece order and you're going to build it in batches of 100, then that means 10 kits that you have to create, 10 SMT machine setups you have to do, etc. And then the assembly cost here is the actual activity that happens to the board. So whether that's pick and place, AOI inspection, visual inspection, X-ray, wash, things like that, things that happen to each and every assembly. Now, these aren't the only 3 categories that you can have within the labor cost bucket, right? You can have more than this. So an example would be a customer setup cost. So there are some businesses out there, I wouldn't say in contract manufacturing, but in other industries that have a cost associated with setting up a new customer. So if you are a repeat customer to that business, then your price would be lower, but the first time you go to them, the price is very high, right? A lot of ERP systems, for example, would have that because there's an implementation cost the first time around or something like that. That's not something that contract manufacturers can necessarily get away with in our industry because typically, the first time you're engaging with a customer, you're trying to show them that you're capable, you're trying to earn their business. So you're typically more competitive on the first one. You're more aggressive on their pricing to be able to prove yourself and get the bigger business down the line. Okay, so let's look at how labor costs adjust as quantity goes up also. We're going to start with looking at the blue lines over here. So by looking at the blue lines, you can see over here, I think you can probably see my cursor over here. So I've got total costs, total setup costs over here, and I've got my total variable costs. So with the blue lines, the thing to note here is that as the quantity increases, the total setup stays the same. It doesn't go up as the quantity increases, but the unit setup drops as the quantity increases. So a good example of this would be if you had $100 worth of setup costs, whether you're building 1 assembly or 100 assemblies, it's going to stay, the total is going to stay at 100. But on a per unit basis, the $100 divides out by 1 over here, so it's the same. But if I'm building 100 units, now it's down to $1 per assembly because the total is still 100. On the flip side, the variable costs over here is proportional. So what ends up happening is as the quantity increases, what you'll see is that the labor cost also proportionally increases. So if I had something that was $5 per assembly, then it would stay $5 per assembly as I get into higher quantities, whether it's 100 assemblies or 500 assemblies or 1,000 assemblies, et cetera. The thing to note here, though, is again, you'll see that there's somewhat of a downward sloping curve right here. And this also becomes a little bit more horizontal as you get into the higher quantity range. And the reason for that is that contract manufacturing is a little bit unique compared to the typical manufacturing companies that are out there. Most manufacturing companies think of variable cost as being a fixed, it's proportional to the quantity, but in contract manufacturing, because you're constantly building new things, you're learning. And so the first assembly, for example, if you're doing a manual visual inspection, might take you 10 minutes, but then over time, you're going to get better, faster, smarter, more efficient, and it'll only take you 5 minutes by the time you do the 1,000th board because you'll know typically where to look for defects and things like that. So that's why you'll see that what happens is you'll see some improvement in the lower quantity range, and then it levels out. And the same thing happens with the total variable expense over here. Okay. By the way, as I continue on this, if you do have any questions as I'm going through it, feel free to write them into the chat. I know some of you already found the chat. That way, if we have some time left over at the end, I'd be happy to try to address some of those questions as well. Okay, continuing on, we're going to look at the overhead cost category over here. And the overhead cost typically, I would say, is identified on the P&L. If you think of a profit and loss statement, the top part of it being the revenue, right below the revenue or the income, you've got the cost of goods sold. So that's your direct expenses. And then typically everything below that is your overhead stuff, right? So you've got your rent, utilities, health insurance, depreciation. And we'll go into this in a little bit more detail later, but those are all of your overhead costs that would fall into this bucket. Now, in terms of what happens with the overhead costs, again, it's a little bit more complicated than the previous one we looked at. So labor, you could break it into multiple things. With overhead, the graph looks a little bit different. It's not, as you can see, it's not a straight or a curved line. What happens is it has a stepping function to it, right? So as I get into a higher volume of production, what happens is that it has a big step up. And the reason for that is think of some of your overhead costs, right? So you can't increase rent by the square footage or by the dollar. What you would do is you'd turn your 10,000 square foot facility and you'd expand it to 15,000. So all of a sudden, overnight, your cost increases. Same thing with management. You can't increase management by fractions. You'd have to hire a manager or don't hire a manager. So those types of costs create an incremental step up rather than a linear trend upwards, right? The other thing I'd say is that on a per unit basis, what ends up happening is that it slopes downwards until you get to one of those steps. And then it jumps up a little bit, and then it goes down again until you get to the next step. And so what that creates is there's a place right here where things get worse before they get better, right? So if I'm looking at this step right here, I can see that there was a period where I was enjoying better and better per unit overhead costs, and then all of a sudden it got worse. And then it slopes down again and gets back under control. But if I don't increase the quantity and I stay stuck right over here, then what ends up happening is that I've overall increased my costs until I increase my overall production and take advantage of the additional capacity that I've just earned. So that's something really important to remember. If you're interested in some follow-up material after this webinar, there's a great book out there that I would recommend called No Man's Land. Feel free to message me afterwards and I'd be happy to send you a link to it as well. But it kind of goes over what that problem looks like when you're too big to be small and too small to be big. Okay, let's move on to the markup. And markup here basically means it's the things we haven't considered yet, right? So the markup can include unknown factors of risk. So for example, if you are taking on some additional risk because the customer has asked for a higher standard of quality or specific guarantees in the warranty agreement, things like that, that's what you're accounting for here is the risk of doing business. And then the other thing that you are accounting for, and sometimes people will split this into a second bucket under markup, is the desired margin, right? So between these two things, what you're considering is markup. And let's look at what that graph looks like is as the quantity increases, your total markup increases, but your unit markup drops, right? So a good example of that is if I have one assembly, I could charge $50 for markup, but if I'm building 100 assemblies, I wouldn't continue to charge 50 per assembly. I might lower it down to 30 per assembly, but overall, my total markup dollars, $30 per assembly times 100 gives me 3,000. So overall, my markup has increased even though the per unit markup has gone down. Okay, so now let's talk about overhead allocation. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go over 4 methods of allocating overhead. This isn't a comprehensive list. There are other ways to do it, but these are the 4 that we see are most common in EMS and most applicable to EMS. So that's why I'm covering them here. And we'll go through each one. And we'll start off with the first one, overhead included in the markup. So overhead included in the markup basically means that, and this is what a lot of companies do when they're, I'd say, at the most basic phase of maturity in terms of quoting in EMS, right? So I'd say you've got your material, you've got your labor figured out, and then what you're doing is you're saying, okay, you know what? I've got $10 of material, $15 of labor, that's $25. I'm going to mark it up 40% to include all of this other stuff that I don't know. right? So that adds $10. And the 40% or the $10 could include manufacturing scrap, it could include risk, it could include overhead, it could include what your expected profit is from this, et cetera. The nice thing about that is that it's very simple, right? You can do some really quick back of the napkin math and come up with a price. It's very fast. The downside of that is it's highly, highly variable, right? So who is to say that 40% was the right number there? Nobody knows, right? It could be that you should have put in 50% or 60% or 90%, or it could be that you should have put in 10%. It's really hard to judge exactly. And a good way to test this is, if you do think you have a good grasp on it, is put yourself in the room with somebody else, don't talk to each other, and try to come up with what is that appropriate percentage. And you'll see that it's very rare that you'd find the same answer between two people. The second thing I'll say is that if you use this method, you don't always know that you've actually covered your actual costs, right? So the example I used here is I've got manufacturing scrap included in here. You don't know that the $1 includes the actual cost, because what if you're only building one assembly? There's going to be a higher amount of proportional scrap than if you're building 1,000 assemblies, for example. So that's why this method, while it's simple and it's fast, it is also very rough in doing so. The next method here is overhead included in the shop rate. So the overhead inclusion in the shop rate basically means that you've got a base wage and then you're adding your overhead costs on top of it by the hour. So breaks and vacations, benefits, management salaries, rent, tools, depreciation, etc. All of those things build into the base labor rate and give you a total of $24 an hour. Now, to clarify, these are sample numbers. They're not meant to be representative. Hopefully nobody's actually getting paid $2 an hour. But the point here being that you're burdening the labor rate so that you can actually just do time study and say, this is how much time it's going to take me to build this, and multiply that by my shop rate, which in this example is 24. And that tells me how much I should charge for the labor and the overhead. And now all I have to do is figure out the material and the markup. One thing I forgot to mention over here is that, so while this does have a slightly more complicated calculation, it is still fairly simple. It's better than the general markup. The hard thing about this is it's very difficult to maintain. And what I mean by that is that we do encounter some companies where somebody at some point in time in the past came up with some calculation to say that the labor rate should be $50 an hour, right? And that's what the shop's been using for so many years. Well, then they'll go back and revisit it, let's say a few years later, and realize that, you know what, per our latest calculation, it's not $50 an hour, it's $60 an hour. Well, that's a 20% increase in your labor rate, and there's no way to account for that. So what I like to say is that what you want to do is adjust your labor rate every time you have a significant change to your overhead, because that's how you're going to keep up with actual costs, or actually being able to amortize your overhead and allocate it appropriately. The other thing also here is that this doesn't really fall into the scope of what we're discussing today, but in terms of labor rates, if you're using the same exact shop rate across all of your departments and activities, then that can also be a potential issue, because there might be a much higher amount of depreciation that should be allocated to surface mount processes versus through-hole processes, for example. Okay, next we're going to look at allocation of overhead by department or activity. And so here I'm going to use an example. So let's just say I've got a bunch of overhead costs. What I would do is I would identify each item in the overhead and I would assign it to one or more department or activities. So let's use this utilities as an example. So I've got an X amount of dollars of utility expense for the year, and I'm going to choose to say that the majority of that utility cost should go towards the surface mount department, because they have this big reflow oven and they've got this the pick and place machines that are running all the time, and it just uses up a lot of energy. So that's the first thing you'd do. Then you'd split that across all the other departments also that need that, right? So I'm going to put 15,000 of utilities towards surface mount. I'm going to put 5,000 towards test, because they do some burn-in testing. And then I'm going to put 1,000 towards touch-up, where really all they need is a light, and that's it. When estimating labor, what ends up happening is the overhead cost is included based on the utilization of that department or activity. So it's kind of like a burden labor rate still, except you get it all broken out. The nice thing about this method is that it's much more accurate. gives you a lot more clarity in what's causing the costs on your assembly to appear. So it's much more granular that way. The downside of this is that it's very difficult to keep up with. If you think about the costs, let's just say as an example, you've got 50 different overhead costs and 20 different departments. You're looking at almost 1,000 different ways that you could allocate those overhead costs into different buckets, right? So that's why it's very difficult to keep up with. And also, the other downside of this is that some costs are not activity driven. So think of things like interest expense, business insurance, so like general liability insurance, legal fees, things like that, where there is no proportion to the amount of SMT activity you have to determine what your general liability insurance is. It's really more based on what your total revenue is or something like that. So that's something else to consider here as well. And then finally, what we're going to look at is overhead allocation by driver. This is one of the more complex ways of doing it. So what we're looking at here is, let's start with an example here. So I've got equipment depreciation cost of $100,000. Equipment operation time that I project for the year is 5,000 hours. And so 100,000 divided by 5,000 gives me $20 an hour. And then what I would do is I would say, okay, for this new job, I already know my material costs, so I'm not worried about that. But for labor, I've got $150 of labor, that's 6 hours. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do $20 an hour for depreciation times 6 hours gives me 120. And so over here, I've got $120 for the depreciation, and then I would have other line items for all the other overhead costs. And overall, that would give me a total down here. Now, this is very similar to the overhead allocation by activities and departments, but the big difference here is the scope of what it means to be a driver. So a driver can be an activity or a department, but it can also be the dollar value of a board, it can be the number of shipments, it can be how many setups you have to do, etc. So it's a lot more flexible in terms of how overhead costs get allocated to a particular job. The pro of this, obviously, is that it's much more accurate, and the downside, just like the last one, is that it's very difficult to maintain. So I would suggest that if you don't have a really, really good Excel model or a software application that can help you with some of these calculations, then it can be really easy to mess it up. It can be really easy to spend a lot of time on it. And the other thing here that's important is the downside can be that if your assumptions on drivers are incorrect, then it can be very easy to over or under allocate your overhead expenses as well. So that's something to consider here. So let's get down to the recommendations. In terms of recommendations, what I have to say is that it really depends on what your business capabilities are to decide what overhead allocation method you should use. And so there's 3 questions I would say that you should consider asking yourself. To start with. The first one is that, do you have the finance resources to keep up with granular tracking? And what I mean by that is that if you have a full-time controller whose only job it is to go through and do some cost accounting, then great, you've got the resources to be able to do it. But if you are a small and growing business and everything is being done by the owner of the business or something like that, then it's really hard to find the time to keep up with this kind of granular tracking unless you've got an automated model or something that helps you keep up with that. The second thing I would say is how accurately do you need to track the metrics is also important, right? So if you are a business, and we see this all the time, there's two, I guess, ends of the spectrum, right? There's businesses where your margins are razor thin, but your volume is really high, so it works out. Where in that case, the overhead allocation being off by a couple points can be the difference between profitable business and unprofitable business. So it's very, very important to make sure that you're tracking your overhead costs accurately. And then the other end of the spectrum is that you are a quick turn prototype shop where customers come to you and write you a blank check and just say, get it back to me as quickly as possible. In those cases, your markup is so high that you're not even going to notice a shift of a couple points of overhead going one direction or the other, because it doesn't really matter to your overall business and sales strategy. So that's the second question you should consider asking yourself. And then the third thing here is, do you have a way to incorporate your cost accounting into action? And this is where a lot of people get lost. It's really easy to go down a rabbit hole and do a lot of cost calculations and retrospectives and things like that, where you're really digging into the cost details. But the question there is that, are you able to quickly and efficiently turn that into action. So for example, just because you know this information, are you able to use that information to now turn quotes faster or be able to identify which customers you're losing money on or something like that? So that's something that you absolutely want to consider as part of which overhead allocation model you use. And so what I'd say as I guess the underscore here is that a blended approach is what fits most EMS businesses, at least the ones that we've encountered. It's not a one-size-fits solution. People don't typically go all one way or all the other way. It really depends on the business, and it depends on a blend of all of those different practices, where sometimes they'll incorporate a portion of the overhead into the markup, and a portion of it will be activity-driven or something like that. Okay, now we're going to talk about determining markup. So in determining markup, basically, before I get started with the things you should consider in determining markup, what I'd like to do is lay down some basic truths here. In talking to the companies that we've talked to so far, I'll say that there are 4 things that we found to be common. The first is that determining markup is not an exact science, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. What I mean by that is there isn't a formula out there that you can say, I don't want to think about it. I want to automatically have it do the markup for me and come up with a final price. That's a very difficult thing to do if you want to stay competitive in this industry because there are so many variables to consider. That's the first thing. The second thing is that everyone does it differently, but the same. And what I mean by that is that people have their own vernacular terms for things, right? So I'll call it one thing, you call it something else, but we're really talking about the same thing. I might say that I use markup, somebody else might say they use margin, but ultimately we're still referring to the same thing, which is how do we account for the risk of doing business and the profit margin we want to capture. So that's the second point here. The third point here is that there are similarities, but they exist by region. And what I mean by that is that, for example, we'll see that let's say the Northwest United States region is more or less similar in the vocabulary and the terminology and things like that they use. And they're a little bit different though from New England. And the reason is, I would suspect, is because one, a lot of people in that region probably learned from each other and had employees that worked for each other. And so best practices got shared at a regional level. But the important takeaway from this is that there's a lot of white papers and things like that out there that you could be referencing that may not necessarily apply to your region. So just mentally prepare yourself to translate whatever they're talking about to meet the terms and terminology that you would use, for example. And then finally, I'll say that a lot of people claim to know the typical markup, right? So a lot of times we'll hear, well, the standard markup in this industry is 15%, and that's all you can charge. Well, the short answer to that is that's not necessarily true, right? Because a lot of times what ends up happening is what people consider to be markup. Remember what we were talking about earlier with the different cost categories. Some people throw additional things into that markup field, so it's not always true to say it's always supposed to be 15%. I would qualify that by saying that you could come up with a standard if everybody defined it the same way, though. Okay, so now we're going to look at the 5 things to consider when determining markup, and we're going to start off with revenue opportunity. So the first thing here is revenue opportunity, and what that means is when you're considering how much to mark up in assembly, the first thing you want to look at is how much potential revenue does it represent. So as you get into higher revenue, then the margin that you can claim on it becomes lower. Seems pretty obvious, but it's important to consider because the second part of this is that your total dollars of markup should increase, right? So one of the good examples of this is think of an assembly where it has, you're lowering your margin as you get into higher quantity. But if you really looked at it, what you'd find is that as you get into higher quantity, you've given yourself overall less profit as well, right? So that doesn't make any sense to do it that way. You want to be overall increasing your total profit, but decreasing the profit you're taking per assembly, for example. So that's the first one. The second thing here is the customer's need. So as the customer has more requirements or as they have a greater need, then you can obviously charge more for that as well, right? So an example would be that if I have a requirement for the boards to be delivered in a 3-day turn, then I can obviously have a higher markup for that. If I have a requirement that I want 25 years of warranty, then I can have a higher markup for that because I'm accounting for a greater amount of risk. So things like that, based on what the customer requires, it's known and expected that there would be a higher markup as the scope of the requirements changes. The third thing here is competition can wear down your margins. So, it's nice to have a customer that you've locked in and they always work with you and you can charge them a fair price. But a lot of times what happens is, especially in this industry, because it is a little bit competitive, what happens is that the way that your competitors approach your customers is they'll offer some kind of entry-level pricing, right? So they'll give you some better pricing than they would normally give just to be able to prove themselves to the customer. And as a result, the greater the number of competition in your area or the greater the number of competition that your customer pits you against, unfortunately, what that sometimes means is that your margins also become lower. You become subject to more price-sensitive buying behavior and things like that. And then finally, I'll say the knowns and the unknowns. And what I mean by this is sometimes you know certain things that will affect what you should mark up your materials as. So for example, if I know that a particular customer is going to come back and change the requirements every 2 days, and they're going to send me some really messy documentation that's different from what I'm quoting right now, things like that, then I might just give myself a little bit of wiggle room from the beginning to make sure that I'm going to account for those types of situations. The unknowns are also equally important. So for example, if I'm making some assumptions as part of my quote, which obviously you're going to make some assumptions, the more the unknowns, the higher the potential margin might be, right? So two things to consider there. One is that there are things that you know that will help you increase or reduce the margin that you're going to, or the markup that you're going to have. And there are things that you don't know that will also increase or lower the markup. With that, I'd like to leave you all with some additional resources here as well. So in case you are interested in learning more about this topic, let me just share with you a couple of resources that I think are really valuable. I'm a big fan of reading online, so some search terms you might want to check out: managerial accounting, cost accounting. There's a few others there. Basically, if you go online, there is a wealth of resources out there through white papers, articles, blog posts, and webinars like this one, where you can learn more about this topic and get into a lot more granularity about what some of the terms we talked about here today mean. If you are a book type person, then there is a great book out there called Managerial Accounting by Garrison, Noreen, and Brewer. And I don't get any royalties on this book, but I do find it to be a very helpful book. It's a textbook, so it's not like a novel that you're going to read as you fall asleep. It is kind of something that you have to engage with, but it's really great because it covers these methods as well as several other methods of cost accounting. So a really great book recommendation there. If you are an online course type learner, then there is a really good course also available on Lynda, which is a company, it's a LinkedIn company. It's called Accounting Foundations Managerial Accounting. So that's one that you should also check out. And then obviously, you can check out our blog. We do cover some of these topics on our blog and on LearnCQ, which if you're a CalcuQuote customer, you know about that already as well. There's a lot of resources, help articles, best practices that we try to load in there pretty frequently. And then just by registering for today's webinar, we're also happy to provide you with a free consultation. So in the follow-up email coming after this webinar, you'll get a link for a free 30-minute consultation if you're interested to learn more about this or to discuss more about this topic of cost modeling, overhead, and markup. With that, thank you very much. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat. I'm willing to hang around for a few minutes and answer them. Otherwise, I will look forward to talking to you all next month at the next of the Scratching the Surface Mount webinar series.